Turgenev his mother's only son? How many illegitimate children did he have? And what's up with that French singer? Did Leo Tolstoy actually challenge Turgenev to a duel for having an affair with his sister? And what does the chest full of bricks have to do with anything? Here are 10 facts about Ivan Turgenev's life. For a proper biography recap, go to my Fathers and Sons video, I'll go into it there. Turgenev's mother, Varvara, was a tyrant. She was physically and mentally abusive to her servants and serfs, but to her children as well. Turgenev remembers in his notes that if he ever dared to ask what was the punishment for, she'd reply in that manipulative/abusive way of "ask yourself why, you know why, take a guess." Turgenev depicted her in all of her awfulness in a story called Mumu. Mumu is based on real-life events. Varvara did actually have a servant named Andrei, who was deaf and mute, a strong and a tall man whom Varvara noticed in one of her country estates and brought to Moscow to serve as her janitor, basically. And Andrei did actually have a dog called Mumu, whom he drowned at the order of Varvara, but he also continued to serve her after that. Turgenev tells the same story, but his protagonist, now called Gerasim, faces three conflicts over the course of the story. First, he loses a girl that he loves when the mistress orders for the girl to marry a different man. Then, when he actually gets his dog Mumu, the mistress first orders to get the dog sold, but the dog finds its way back to Gerasim. And the third, when she actually orders for Gerasim to get rid of the dog. But having killed the dog, he actually leaves his mistress in a kind of metaphor for his own liberation, which is something that his real-life prototype never got to do. And we have the privilege of reading this story at the tender age of 10 years old because it's part of the school program. So if you ever wonder why Russian people rarely smile, this might be it. Maybe reading a story about deaf-mute man killing his beloved pet is not something for children. Maybe? During his teenage years, Turgenev experienced his first love and first heartbreak. At the time, they were living on a dacha somewhere near Moscow, and the nearby dacha was occupied by Princess Shukhovskaya, who had a 19-year-old daughter, Ekaterina, a tall, beautiful woman, and Turgenev fell madly in love. He even tried to court her, but soon found out that she was quite indifferent towards him, but was completely swept off her feet by none other than Turgenev's own father, Sergei. Turgenev wrote the story First Love some 30 years after the events have taken place. In there, a fictional Ekaterina tells a fictional Ivan, "No, I can't care for people I have to look down upon. I may have someone who can master me." And that was true in a sense that Sergei had this presence about him that demanded attention. That's probably why his relationship with Varvara, his own wife, never worked out. And also, ironically, Ivan would spend his whole life kind of looking up to his women, adoring them, but never truly mastering them. 1838, Turgenev was traveling to Europe for the first time, and suddenly the ship began to sink. The panic spread around the ship, and young Turgenev also lost his composure that day. The rumors spread really quickly that he was quite literally pushing women and children out of his way to the lifeboat, screaming that he was his mother's only son. The incident quickly spread around the Russian salons. Varvara sent her son an angry letter chastising him for making a scene and becoming a mockery in their circles. This story chased Turgenev for most of his life, the incident quite comical, especially since it's basically not true from the get-go. Ivan was not his mother's only son, he had a brother. Turgenev tried to set the record straight sometime later in life. He said that yes, this did actually happen, the ship was sinking and he lost his composure, but he never cried about his mother. What he actually did is he tried to bribe a random sailor if only he promised to get him to shore safely. He was also screaming and moaning pitifully, "Oh, to die so young." Everyone on the boat was okay, by the way. They were close to shore. They all made it. Turgenev was in Europe studying, but also he was partying and spending a lot of money. Varvara took the separation from her sons quite harsh, especially Ivan, who was her favorite, while that didn't amount to much. But Ivan, who finally broke free, he was enjoying life, not sending his dear old mom any letters, not even a thank you for the money transfers. So once he's already spent most of his allowance, and there was a parcel waiting for him at the post office, but the parcel was not prepaid for. So he scrambled together some money, paid for the delivery, brought this heavy chest back home, opened it up, hoping for that Varvara sent him something nice, and what he saw was actually a chest full of bricks. And while that can be considered a little bit of teasing or trolling from Varvara, depending on how you tell the story, what she did later was not nice. Around 1850, she got ill, and so her sons hurried home to see her, but having seen them, she recovered pretty quickly. The brothers, now adults, didn't like to rely on her allowances for their spending, so they used the opportunity to ask for a source of income from her. Varvara offered to give them an estate each with some land and some serfs, but that never came to fruition because she at the same time ordered for all of the grain and the harvest to be sold, so there was nothing left for the sowing season. Both brothers refused such gift. Ivan was screaming, "Who are you torturing? Everybody. Who can breathe freely next to you? Can you not understand? We're not children anymore. Such a gesture from you is insulting. You're scared of giving us anything, afraid of losing control over us. We've always been faithful sons, and yet you have no faith in us. You only trust your power, and what has that given to you? Only the right to torture everyone." Varvara then cried that she had no children and left the room and smashed Ivan's portrait on the ground. The glass shards were left lying on the floor for multiple months. Ivan made multiple attempts at reconciliation, but Varvara was relentless. Only in her last moments did she write, "My children, forgive me, and you, my God, forgive me. For pride, this deathly sin has always been mine." Nikolai, Ivan's older brother, got to see her before the end. Ivan never made it in time to see her. In his life, Turgenev had many loves, but his only true love was Pauline Verdot. Pauline, née Michelle Ferdinand Pauline Garcia, she came from a musical family. She found success pretty early thanks to her beautiful contralto. This is probably the most flattering portrait of her. She was not necessarily the most beautiful woman out there, but she was incredibly charming and had that presence about her. Fun fact about her, she was actually friends with Georges Sand, and it was Georges who suggested that Pauline should marry Louis Verdot, who was 20 years her senior, but was also the director of the Italian musical theatre. And that's how Turgenev actually first saw her. She was on tour in St. Petersburg, 1843. Turgenev became obsessed with her. He flocked her with all of the other admirers of hers. Louis just generally turned a blind eye to her affairs. But Turgenev followed them to Europe, and he basically lived with them for the longest time. It's rather difficult to say what kind of relationship they had. They've been together on and off for 40 years. The last 20, they were inseparable. Researchers base their assumptions on Turgenev's letters, which are quite passionate and full of love, but Pauline, she destroyed all of her letters, so we only have one side of the picture. Biographers also describe Pauline as a smart and kind of calculated woman who was likely not swept off her feet by these passions, but she likely was quite flattered by Turgenev's affections, at least early on. Because researchers also like to describe this feeling between them as something transcendental, a love greater than this sexual or even romantic feeling. Pauline remained married to Louis Verdot, and yet they've managed to establish this life between them altogether, the three of them. So it was likely to their benefit rather their detriment. When Turgenev came to the Spassky estate 1850, he was quite surprised to discover that he had an 8-year-old daughter. 1841, he had a brief affair with Avdotia Ivanova, a seamstress in his mother's estate, but that didn't amount to nothing and he left for Europe. But when Varvara found out about Avdotia's pregnancy, she brought her to Moscow, where Pelagia was born. Avdotia then was given a substantial pension to basically make her go away and forget about the child, and Varvara took Pelagia to Spassky. Varvara never acknowledged the child as kin. She fed and clothed her, but she also expected her to work around the house. And we can assume that Varvara was even more abusive towards this bastard child than she ever was to her children or serfs. So when Turgenev found out about the child, he felt responsibility for her, and he came up with the best idea. He wrote to Pauline Verdot asking what to do, and Paulina said that yes, she would take the child in, and thus Pelagia was sent off to France to be raised along with the 4 Verdot children. Pelagia was also renamed Paulinette, likely in a weird attempt to make her sound more like Pauline. Turgenev then saw Paulinette only 6 years later. By that point, she only spoke French, which Turgenev found adorable. But the problem was that Pauline and Paulinette didn't get along. They didn't like each other. So Turgenev took Paulinette and installed himself with Paris. There she met a Gaston Breuer, whom she married at 17 years old. Turgenev gave her a quite decent dowry of 150,000 francs. And the couple had 2 children, Jean and Georges. Gaston, though, he went bankrupt some 7 years later, and Paulinette took the kids and left him and installed herself in Switzerland. Turgenev maybe even wanted to help her out, but apparently he didn't manage to, and he passed away. And in his will, he left everything to Pauline Verdot, who didn't give Paulinette anything, and Paulinette even tried to contest the will, but she lost. And neither Jean nor Georges had any children of their own, so the Ivan Turgenev line ended with his grandchildren. 1852, Nikolai Gogol passed away. Quite stricken by the news, Turgenev wrote an obituary. Gogol's dead. What Russian soul is not shaken up by these words? This loss is so cruel and so sudden that we do not want to believe it, and yet he's dead. This man that we now have the right, this bitter right given to us by death, to call great. A man that with his name defined an epoch in the history of our literature, and we are proud of him as one of our glories. Strictly speaking, there was nothing in there calling for a rebellion, but all this buzz around Gogol's death made the Tsar police quite suspicious, and they ordered to not let anything about him into print. Moskovsky Ведомости, however, printed the obituary written by Turgenev, and Turgenev got arrested for insubordinance and violating censor's orders. He spent a month in Admiralteyskaya prison in pretty decent conditions, with good food, with books and visitation rights. He was let out 1852, but was put under police surveillance and sent off to the Spassky estate, basically under a very loose house arrest. Researchers speculate that this arrest had very little to do with the obituary or Gogol, and was simply used as a pretext to get Turgenev out of St. Petersburg. Turgenev made his views on slavery known. He was believed to be too liberal already, and he also traveled to Europe quite a bit. And Nikolai I, he was definitely afraid of revolutionary spirits spreading from Europe into Russia, and so his censorship was one of the harshest. Turgenev always stood against Russian serfdom, which is basically slavery, just with a better branding manager. Turgenev has always been vocal about it, and that even got him in hot water with Nikolai I, a Tsar with reactionary agenda. Russia does often go through these periods of progress and reforms, and then falls back into reactionary periods and counter-reforms. Can you guess which period we're in now? But the next Tsar, Alexander II, brought the period of change. Some say that he liked Turgenev's A Sportsman's Sketches, a series of stories about Russian peasant men. He liked them to the point that it actually influenced/persuaded him into abolishing serfdom 1861. The irony is that Turgenev sang praises to the Russian peasant man, depicted him as smart and hardworking, and Turgenev genuinely believed that all men should be free. But at the same time, Turgenev liked being a nobleman and part of the gentry and all of the wealth that comes with it. So when 1861 the serfs were freed, they were freed without the land that they worked on for generations. And now the free peasant men were welcome to rent the land from their previous owners and build their fortune with hard work and time. And as you can imagine, they were not quite happy about that and demanded to be freed with the land. Turgenev, who believed himself a generous and kind landowner, especially after his mother's atrocities, was quite disappointed and angry at his men for turning against him, especially since he fought for their freedom. He called them ungrateful and left Russian estate in a huff and installed himself in Baden-Baden. And I find it very interesting that in his mind these two things were quite separate from one another. He quite genuinely, passionately believed that slavery needs to be abolished and all men should be free, but at the same time he was not willing to part with the wealth that was built over generations of the same slave labor. It's that noble arrogance of them deserving this generational wealth that coexists with quite humane impulse to give a man a chance and freedom, and it's fascinating to me. Relationships in literary circles of the 19th century were quite tense. Most of these talented authors, they knew each other. Some of them were editing magazines, but most of them, if not all of them, were published in said magazines, so tensions were running high. At the time, the literary critics were also having a huge influence as to who's going to make it and who's not. Turgenev got a chance to run into the monoliths of the previous wave of the Russian authors. For example, he's seen Gogol teach history in St. Petersburg. And he was actually quite disappointed because some of you may remember Gogol was not the most talented or engaged teacher. He did not pay much attention to his lectures. Turgenev would also remember a moment where he ran into Pushkin. He went to see a man called Pletnev, a friend of Alexander Pushkin and Zhukovsky, and Pushkin was just leaving, he threw some phrase away and he was off, and that was quite an impactful meeting for Turgenev. I think they saw each other somewhere in the circles, but I don't think they've ever had a kind of proper conversation between the two. But the two stories I wanted to tell you today is the story between Turgenev and Leo Tolstoy and Turgenev and Fedor Dostoevsky. Turgenev was 10 years Tolstoy's senior, so he was already an established author by the time that Leo Tolstoy came on stage. They first met in 1855. Tolstoy just came from Sevastopol to St. Petersburg, and the first wave of success were crashing down on him. But Tolstoy also loved Turgenev's sportsman sketches, so he rushed to see Turgenev. And Turgenev has already noticed this up-and-coming writer, and he even offered for Tolstoy to stay with him in his apartment, and he introduced Tolstoy to his friends in Современник magazine. But they soon started to get on each other's nerves. Turgenev was this fancy aristocrat who paid a lot of attention to his appearance, a Russian dandy of sorts, and he also believed himself a great artist. And Tolstoy was already starting on the path of his own ideology and philosophy that kind of rejected all of this luster. They fought a lot, which bothered both of them, likely because they saw this talent in one another, but they just couldn't get along. Another thorn in their relationship was Maria Tolstaya, Leo Tolstoy's sister. Turgenev met her even before he met Tolstoy. She lived quite close to the Spassky estate where Turgenev spent his exile, 1852 to 54. She was unhappily married, and Turgenev was this tall, beautiful man who used to read her stories. And so she fell in love, and he almost did, but did not. So Maria likely misinterpreted his amiability as something more. And then Turgenev's exile was lifted, Pauline Viardot summoned him, and so he left. Maria found out about her husband's cheating, and she actually took the kids and left him, 1857, and she wrote to Turgenev informing him of her new status, kind of fully expecting him to do something about it. And he wrote back to her saying that he's there for her, but as a friend. Ouch. Tolstoy wrote in his diary something like, Turgenev is not doing right by Maria. And another weird coincidence is that Varvara, Turgenev's mother, she had an affair with her doctor, and she even gave birth to a child, a daughter, whom she also called Varvara for some reason. And that Varvara, she was a bastard, not acknowledged by either party, but her father was Andrei Bers, Sofia Bers's father, and Sofia Bers was Leo Tolstoy's wife. So Turgenev, who had a half-sister, who was also half-sister of Leo Tolstoy's wife. But the true conflict happened 1861 on the estate of a poet named Fedor. Turgenev was quite proudly telling a story about his daughter Paulinette, who was kind of mending clothes for the poor folk. And Tolstoy said that such a display of a noble girl with a poor man's rags in her lap is just a performance and not true charity. Some more words were said, then letters were exchanged. Tolstoy was even close to challenging Turgenev to a duel, but through that series of letters they managed to subdue the conflict a little bit, but they haven't spoken to each other for 17 years after that. Their reconciliation happened in the late years of Turgenev's life. He came to Moscow 1878 for the opening of the Pushkin monument, and that's when he went to go and see Tolstoy in Yasnaya Polyana. They've exchanged letters before that, so that meeting was already on better terms. One of the Tolstoy's daughters remembers in her diaries that both authors were quite excited to see one another. They hugged, and then they decided to do something fun. And so they put like a piece of wood on another piece of wood, creating like a makeshift seesaw, and they would jump on that seesaw. I just find the image hilarious, this bearded old man just jumping on a seesaw. It's fascinating. But they saw each other another few times afterwards, but that was already close to Turgenev's death, 1883. So at least they parted on good terms. Now, Dostoevsky, though... Dostoevsky and Turgenev met sometime in the 1840s. Dostoevsky has just written his first novel, Poor Folk, which was highly praised by the critics, so Dostoevsky was brought into the literary salons of the time. Turgenev at the time was still known as a poet, because that's how he started, and Dostoevsky, well... This newfound fame, it went straight to his head. He was arrogant and brash, and all of these people in the Savremenniki magazine, they didn't particularly like that. Turgenev and Nekrasov wrote a sarcastic epigram, kind of making fun of Dostoevsky and hurt him. That only served to drive Dostoevsky away from the Savremenniki folks and right into the waiting arms of the Petrashevsky and his group, and that didn't work out that well for Dostoevsky. But more on that sometime later. Because of these events, Dostoevsky kind of disappeared from the stage for years, returning sometime in the mid-1850s, and by that point, Turgenev was a star. He was the Russian author. He was also the highest paid author, which pissed Dostoevsky off, because he was always in debt, he had that gambling addiction, and this fancy aristocrat Turgenev never had to worry about money, and he could write just when he had inspiration, a luxury that Dostoevsky never had, because he always wrote needing money. Dostoevsky's first wife probably also didn't help. She called Turgenev her favorite author. Ouch. A notable incident between these two happened sometime later in the 1860s. Dostoevsky went to see Turgenev in Baden-Baden because he owed him money, but he just lost everything gambling once again, so he was likely angry and embarrassed, and he came in guns blazing. Now, researchers say that what likely happened was that Turgenev allowed Dostoevsky to rant. He kind of insulted Turgenev's last novel, Fume. He suggested Turgenev buy a telescope if he wanted to actually write about Russia, not living in Russia, and he insulted Germans, Turgenev, and then left. You might know that Dostoevsky was a raging Slavophile. He believed in the superiority of the Russian nation, and he was deeply religious. Turgenev, by that point, was none of that. He was almost an atheist. He was quite disappointed in Russia and believed European way to be superior. So their conflict is deeply rooted in their beliefs. They have very little in terms of common ground. Dostoevsky then wrote a character in his novel Demons, a literary person Karmazinov, a talentless writer, and that was supposed to be a character of Turgenev. The closest they came to a standstill happened at that Pushkin celebration in Moscow, 1878. When he was giving a speech, he named the female character in Turgenev's The Home of the Gentry one of the best female characters in Russian literature. But then Turgenev, in a letter to Saltykov-Shchedrin, called Dostoevsky the Russian Marquis de Sade, and that was already after Dostoevsky's death, so they never truly got along, and that feud never went away. Some of these facts were included in the biography recap that I did in the Fathers and Sons video, but I've tried to expand on them a little bit here, so hopefully you've learned something new and interesting, so let me know.